Okay. Hi, Lapland, and welcome to this workshop on argumentation and an introduction to debating. My name is Olivia, and I was meant to be running this workshop earlier this week, I believe, but we had some technical difficulties. So now you get a video instead. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how to structure an argument and make it compelling, and in particular, how to make it invulnerable to attacks, which is something that would apply whether you are considering of trying debating, whether you're interested in public speaking in general, for presentations or for interviews or anything of the sort. But it also applies if you're ever trying to convince anybody, be that in an essay, in a university presentation, or just talking to friends or to people you need to convince politically or whatnot. To quickly introduce myself first. So as I said, my name is Olivia, and I'm coming to this workshop with a background in competitive debating. So I started when I was in school in Sweden, and then I represented my universities at UCL and Sciences Po in Paris. I'm currently heading the European University Debating Championships. I've won and been best speaker at around 10 competitions in Europe, and I've been the chief adjudicator, so the head organizer, I suppose, of around 45 competitions around Europe. And I've also worked in coaching debating for a few years. So hopefully there's a couple of things that might be useful to you. As I said, whether you're interested in debating or not, it's about how to build an argument in general. So to start with, I just want to chat very quickly on a couple of the basics of what are the components of a good argument. What are the steps that you need to fill to be able to convince anybody of anything? And I think there's 4 things that are particularly important. The first thing is any argument has to be clear, then it has to be proven, then you need to do what we call impacting, and then you need to give a comparison. I'll explain these things in turn. So the first thing is your argument has to be clear. You need to have a very clear headline for your argument, give it a sort of title. And if you don't have that, it's very difficult for people to follow what it is that you're trying to convince them of, what it is that you're trying to prove, right? So it's never a good strategy to start on a sort of rant of ideas. You always want to give them a headline to put your things together and maybe have several reasons or several subpoints that lead to one joint conclusion, okay? But one further piece of advice that I would give is you want to make that headline the conclusion itself. So very often when people have arguments, they say things like, first I'm going to talk about the principle, next I'm going to talk about what happens in practice. Or first I'm going to talk about the economic consequences, next about the political consequences, which is interesting, but it isn't very useful in terms of giving your audience or giving your judge or your opponent a sense of what you're trying to prove, of what you actually want to convince them of. So you often want to have a clear headline of the conclusion, right? And you want to put this in a sentence. For example, this policy will be bad for the rehabilitation of prisoners. This policy will harm the developing world. This policy will benefit education for the most disadvantaged children in particular. That is much better than saying things like education, children, prisoners, because it gives people a sense of what it is that you are trying to go for, and it puts everything you're going to say afterwards in a context. So it needs to be clear what it is that you're trying to prove. If you don't know what you're trying to prove in a sentence, then you don't have an argument yet, you just have an idea, right? You need to structure it and you need to have a conclusion. The second thing, and this is the most important bit perhaps, is your argument has to be proven. But this is where very often people start going wrong. So what is it that you need to do to prove an argument? You need to explain why something is true and why something is good or bad. And you want to have one clear sentence of causation that says X, Y, and Z is going to lead to A, B, and C. Here is why one concrete individual or a clear group of people, a clear actor, is going to be affected and change their way of acting. And what to think about here is essentially this is the same tactic that politicians use. Whenever they're trying to convince anybody of anything, you need to have a specific group of people that you can describe, that you can touch, that you can feel, that you can care about, right? It's no use talking of vague principles or too vague or too broad groups of people, like this will help citizens, or this will help the economy, this will help democracy. It's always useful if you can pin it down to the specifics, right? The way that we do this is, we'll try to think of examples, try to think of who is likely to be the most affected, either the most benefited or the most damaged by a policy, and then describe them and tell us why they matter, right? Perhaps you want to say that they're very vulnerable and therefore they need support. Give us a reason why you think they're relevant and it's a group of people we should care about, okay? So as I said, it's a political campaigning test. Is it people that we can picture, and is it people that we can care about? Then you need to explain what the currency of harm or benefit for this group of people is. So if you're saying the policy is going to benefit them, that's great, but in what way, right? So is it going to be in terms of money, in terms of their quality of life, in terms of their happiness? Does it lead to further consequences? Explain how long or severe the impact is going to be, okay? I'll give you a couple of examples so you see what I mean. Very often in debates, people will make arguments that are a little bit too vague, right? So they'll say things like, we shouldn't have unlimited immigration because it's going to lead to a backlash, or this policy will send a message that Putin's actions are illegitimate, or a certain dictator's actions are illegitimate, or this will give a platform to the LGBT movement, right? Those are arguments that we call narratives arguments, when you're saying that something is going to change in the way we talk about the world or think about the world. And that's a very common and very good kind of argument, but what you need to do is to explain what happens after that narrative. What happens after people start thinking differently? In what way do they act differently? Do they vote differently? What are the concrete actions that follow? And who is affected by it, right? Is it minorities in countries with poor human rights records that are affected? Or is it LGBT people that now have a chance to stand up for policies that they want that are useful, they have more of a political voice, and therefore that leads to changes? Does that make sense? So you shouldn't stop the argument whenever you say there's going to be a change in the way people think, but in the way that people act, and that leads to the consequences that affect people. That's a complete argument, okay? Similarly, very often people talk about principles, and they say things like, we should allow unlimited immigration because borders are arbitrary, or this policy, I don't know, having the death penalty or enhancing crimes depending on your intent, right? So if you murder someone because of their gender or because of their ethnicity, very often you get a harsher punishment than if you murder them for personal reasons. So you might debate that and say that it's harmful that it leads to the same type of crime receiving different treatment or different punishment. So with those kinds of principle arguments, you need to explain why that principle is important. You need to convince your audience that something being arbitrary, like borders, means that it's bad. Okay, the color of your eyes is somewhat arbitrary. The color of your hair, or if I roll a dice, the number that comes out is arbitrary, but that doesn't mean that it is necessarily immoral. So you need to explain why we think it's bad if we make important decisions based on things that are arbitrary. And if you're saying that it's bad for the same punishment to get two different kinds of treatment, again, you need to explain why that's the case, why it is that's very important, that you uphold this principle, why people care about it, what consequences follow. And lastly, this also applies if you're talking about very either generic outcomes or very value-neutral outcomes. In a lot of debates, political debates, just general discussions, people make arguments like this will improve the economy, this will improve democratic participation, where, again, it's very vague and it's unclear how much of a benefit it's going to be and why we should care about it as a very general outcome. Whereas you're likely to be successful if you can have concrete outcomes that you can convince your audience of. And similarly, if you have what we call a value-neutral outcome, you might say things like, this policy will allow businesses to compete with large multinational corporations in the developing world, which is good because small businesses are better than large ones. And very often people take that to be obvious, and they don't explain why that's the case. But you do need to do that. You need to explain why an outcome is good or bad. You can't assume that your audience shares the same intuitions as you do. Okay? So when you're proving an argument, you need to be taking all of these steps. You need to explain A, why something is going to happen, why it's true, give reasons for it, perhaps give examples. And B, you need to explain why that outcome is good or is bad. And the way you do that is by relating it to specific people that are going to change the way they act, have more opportunities, have some kind of benefit. And you want to explain what that is. Okay? So an argument has to be clear and it has to be proven. There's two more things that you need to do. Firstly, it needs to be impacted. That is where you're convincing the judge or your audience or your opponent that the argument you were talking about matters. Essentially, you're insulating yourself from someone saying, right, so what? We don't care. That's not important to us. And you saw that very often with the Brexit referendum and political campaigns around that, right? You'd have one side saying there's a democratic deficit, and the other in the European Union, and the other side saying, we don't care. There's always a democratic deficit in any kind of political organization, in any kind of state structure. So the question you need to answer is, why is that a problem? Why is that immoral? Why is that enough to decide that we should leave the European Union? Or on the other side, you're saying things like, you owe some kind of solidarity to other European states, perhaps to accept refugees or to contribute funding or to work together to prevent a war and foster cooperation. And you had the counter argument to that was, who cares? We don't care about solidarity. Well, it's In some cases, this was the counter-argument. We don't care about European neighbours. We don't see why this is an important principle. So what you need to do then is to convince whoever you're trying to convince that it is an important principle, that it is an obligation we have. It's a benefit that's very important and we ought to prioritise over others. Okay? For example, if you have debates about schooling policy, it's very likely that your arguments are about who benefits children the most, right? And you can justify that by saying the purpose of the schooling system is to help children. So therefore, we don't care about the economy. We don't care about parents. We don't care about society at large. We care about fulfilling the one specific function, because if we don't do it, nobody else will. And that is educating children. Or if you're talking about the state in general, you might say that you need to protect certain groups because they're the most vulnerable and they don't have the means of helping themselves if we don't help them. Or you can argue based on need. We ought to help first the ones that need it the most. Or you might argue based on desert and say we need to help the ones that deserve it the most, that have followed the laws of the country, over others that have not done so. It's a sort of reciprocal relationship. You can do it in 100 different ways, but what's important is you need to explain why your benefit is important, and you need to get people to care about that benefit and give us reasons for that. And lastly, a good way to do that is by drawing a comparison. Remember that in any debate, it's you versus an opponent. So you're defending a certain group of people, you're defending a kind of benefit, your opponent is defending another kind of people and another kind of benefit. So it's not enough to say why your benefit matters in isolation. In the Brexit example, why solidarity matters. You need to explain why solidarity matters more than the fact there's a democratic deficit, or why solidarity matters more than whatever's in the UK's individual interests in the short term. Okay, and this is one of the best strategies in debating. So I'll give you an example of a motion that you might have. A typical debating motion might say something like, this House would abolish the minimum wage. And on one side, you have an argument that says abolishing a minimum wage or having a very low minimum wage would harm workers because now they have less money in their pockets. They're left more vulnerable against their employers who will take the advantage and give them as little money as possible. So now they're much worse off. And then on the other side, you might have an argument that says, right, but also a lot of companies will be able to employ more people. So there's people that were previously unemployed that now have more money, so we're benefiting them more. Okay, both of these arguments might be true. And obviously in debating, you want to contest and respond and deny the logic of the other side. But it's likely that you won't be able to completely dismantle that argument so that nothing is left at all. So what you want to do in that situation is you want to explain why your benefit is more important than the benefit on the other side. For example, you might say that helping people that do not have a job at all get a job is better than helping people get slightly more money within their job. So you're saying the group of people you help by abolishing the minimum wage is more important than the group of people that you harm. And you might say this is true because they're the most vulnerable, the difference for them is bigger, something of the sort, right? You can explain why the difference between not having a job and having a job is so significant in your quality of life. It enables you to have meaning, it enables you to have structure, it enables you to meet people, it enables you to get inspired and motivated, etc., etc. Whereas the difference in a small amount of money is unlikely to be a game changer. Okay, that's one example of how you can compare different arguments to each other. Another example would be any motion about the criminal justice system. And you see that very often. Motions like, this House would abolish prisons. This House would introduce the death penalty. This House would encourage companies to hire previous prisoners, right? Previous people that had been in jail for a crime. And in these motions, you have a lot of different benefits you can go for. You can say this is important because of deterrence and protecting society in the short term or the long term. You can say it's important in terms of punishment, the fact that people should get what they deserve, and this is an important moral principle. Or you might say it's important for rehabilitation, getting people that have committed a crime to improve how they see the world and to improve how keen they are to follow laws in a way that helps protect society after they leave prison as well. Okay, so whatever argument you're going for, and whichever one of these benefits you think that you are achieving, you need to compare it to the others. And you need to explain why rehabilitation is more important than deterrence, or why deterrence is more important than punishment for the hell of punishment. Okay, so those are a couple of examples of how to impact and how to compare an argument. So as I said, it has to be clear, has to be proven, you need to impact it, and you need to explain why it's more important in particular than the arguments on the other side. Okay, I'm going to give you two examples of how this would work out if you're making a full argument in a debate. So an example of a debate motion that you might have is this house would not host major sporting events in countries with human rights violations. Okay, so if a country doesn't have a good track record of protecting human rights, you wouldn't, for example, host the Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, things like that. So one argument that you might want to make in that motion is to say that hosting sporting events grants legitimacy and strengthens the power of oppressive leaders. It's one of the most common arguments that you have. So the first thing you need to do is obviously be very clear in how you present it. Notice that I haven't said things like legitimacy or it's immoral. I'm saying exactly the consequence I want you to believe, the conclusion I want you to draw. Hosting sporting events grants legitimacy and strengthens the power of oppressive leaders. Therefore, it's a reason not to do the motion, right? It's a reason to not host them there. So the first thing you need to do is you need to explain why this is the case. And it's not enough to just assert that it gives them legitimacy and not explain what legitimacy is or how it works or why it matters. So, you know, who cares about legitimacy? What is that? How does that play out in foreign affairs or in internal diplomacy within the country? So you need to explain the mechanisms by which it matters. And remember, it changes behavior and it changes people's minds in a way that leads to action. So, for example, you might say that hosting a major sporting event gives oppressors an excuse to get positive media coverage, which reduces international pressure at, I don't know, the UN level, media level, NGOs and protests that make their actions look bad. You might say that it allows them to rally citizens together in a nationalistic celebration, which promotes pride, which promotes cohesion, and therefore is likely to strengthen the ideology that they want people to have and support for their leader that they want people to have so that they don't have a credible opposition, and they can take credit for this amazing event. You can say it gives them tourism money, which again allows them to take credit for developing the country. So that is how you are giving them legitimacy, and that is how potentially you're strengthening the regime. But you can take one step further, and you need to explain why this outcome is harmful. And the way you do that is by being specific and explaining what happens to people on the ground. For example, once you have more legitimacy internationally, and therefore less pressure from the UN, once you have more political support at home, once you have more money with which to carry out whatever you want to do, you are able to be more oppressive. Okay, this is the conclusion that really matters in the debate and the outcome that we care about. You say that it can act more against minorities, you can silence the opposition more, you can silence the media more, you have more financial and political tools to do those things, and those things harm people on the ground. Okay, then you need to explain why that's important, and you need to compare it to other benefits that the opposition might bring. So, for example, they might talk about how media coverage brings awareness, how money brings development. So then you need to explain why are these outcomes more likely than their outcomes of development and positive awareness, and why is it that our outcomes matter more? Why is it more harmful if a regime is more oppressive, even if potentially it gives some more money for development, or even if potentially it gets some awareness globally that there's an issue? Does that translate into action? Okay, so that's an example of an argument. And I'm aware that a lot of these things sound obvious whenever someone explains it to you. It's obvious that, you know, legitimacy works in these ways. It's obvious that money matters. It's obvious that not having political pressure is easy for the dictator and therefore gives them more power. But what I would say is that debating is very often about breaking down the obvious and explaining the obvious in clever ways, in ways that people haven't thought about before. And debating is also about questioning the obvious, asking yourselves, why do we think this is true? And is it always true? Is there, I mean, the truth is that reality is always more complicated than that. So always trying to take one or two extra steps and finding mechanisms for why things are true, finding unique and clever and original explanations for why things are true. That's why we do what we do. I'll give you one more example, which is censoring the media in times of war. Okay, so a motion would be this House would censor the media in times of war. And an argument you might run is that in times of war, the media can be distorted and cause harmful shifts in policy that can have deadly consequences. Okay, and how would you explain that? So you might say, for example, that in the media in times of war, you can see soldiers fighting, you can see them dying. Often it looks very brutal. You're seeing people from your country risking their lives, and that this leads to an irrational response. Okay, rather than a cost-benefit calculation. It makes you afraid and it makes you think that it's not worth it. You might also say that the war seems unwinnable when you portray it in the media. You create the impression that you can't fight because you're never going to win, you're never going to get a meaningful resolution to the conflict. You're seeing broken buildings, you're seeing bombs, you're seeing people dying, and it gives you a sense of hopelessness, which might encourage you to want to just get out of there as quickly as possible, regardless of the consequences. You might also say that it gets people to react to specific events rather than not putting them in context, not understanding in detail how the war works, but reacting to one specific bombing that makes the news, for instance. And maybe it's a simplistic understanding. You think there's a good guy versus a bad guy. Maybe you care more about your soldiers, the countries that you've never heard about before. So all of these things means that the media changes public opinion. Okay, that's the argument I want to prove. But so far, I haven't proven why that leads to an outcome. Okay, so even if there's a change to public opinion, why does that matter? What happens as a result? What is going to change in the world as a result of a change in public opinion? Okay, that's when you need to get to an outcome. And what you might want to say here is that politicians or generals in the army care about public opinion and they react based on public opinion. Okay, there's mechanisms, for example, to decide whether you go in or out of a war based on public support. If you have enough protests and demonstrations and signatures, then sometimes it can force a country to leave, in particular if there's elections coming up, for instance, in particular if they think that they're losing support at home, okay? So that's a possible mechanism by which the change in public opinion can change decisions on the ground in war. And then what you need to do is explain why that decision on the ground in war is harmful and why it leads to bad consequences. Maybe because it's sudden, maybe because it isn't well informed, and therefore that can lead to more people dying than otherwise, okay? And then you need to, lastly, the very final step is, as I said, you need to compare it. You need to explain why having the best decisions in war that aren't influenced by sudden shifts in public opinion is more important than some of the things that the opposition might talk to you about. So they might talk about the importance of transparency, for example, the importance of holding your government accountable and knowing what they are doing with taxpayer money and with lives of citizens. So you then need to think of reasons for why one is more important than the other, okay? Some examples might be to say, in war, we always trade off transparency. We never give up confidential information because it might harm the kind of missions that you're engaging in. And this is just another example. If you give this information, it might harm the missions you're engaging in. So therefore, it's okay to restrict that information. Okay, so as I said, this is the sort of basics in terms of how to build an argument and what are the boxes that you need to tick. It applies in debating, but it also really does help you with everything else. This is roughly the way that I structure essays, policy briefs if you're working for international institutions. It's the way I try to think in interviews, the way that I express myself in emails or in presentations, when talking to my boss, when trying to convince people. You always need to start with your point. You need to justify it, not just assert it and hope that they agree with you because you're saying it very strongly. And then when you're done, you need to explain A, why they should care about the group you're talking about, the benefit you care about, and B, acknowledge that there is a trade-off. Acknowledge that the other side has a different benefit, that they might care about other things too, and then you need to win on that trade-off and explain why your point matters more than the benefits the other side wants to achieve. This is how you generally not only win an argument, but also convince people and get them to see that you understand their point of view, you are taking them at their best, and you're explaining why, even if they care very much about whatever they want to achieve, here is why yours is also important. Okay? There's another way to structure this that also helps, which is something we call PEAL, which is point, explanation, example, link. Essentially, that means you start with your point, you explain it, you give an example, and the link is where you say, here is why you should care. Here is why this means that we should do what I say we should do. Okay? So, as I said, that's mostly the basics of how to structure an argument. There's also one more thing that I want to chat about quickly, and that is, what are some top tips in terms of the most common mistakes that I see very often? And what are some good ways to make sure that your argument is not only a clear argument or just a compelling argument, but one that is very difficult to attack, and it's very difficult for people to find the flaws in and therefore try to contradict you, okay? And I think there's 4 or 5 things that I think can be very useful. So firstly, I've already mentioned specificity, so I won't go into it again, but you want to give your audience a very specific, clear sense of what you mean and what benefits you think you achieve. Rather than saying things like, we help democracy, we help the economy, you want very clear mechanisms of X, Y, and Z will happen, which enables A, B, and C to act in a certain way, which helps them in these 4 reasons. Okay, specificity is incredibly valuable because you give people a concrete logic, right, and concrete examples of what could happen, and then it's obvious that that matters. Secondly, you want to be careful of relying on proving that something is possible rather than proving that something is probable. Okay, one of the biggest mistakes that I see in debating at every level, including the US presidential elections, any debate you can think of, is people ask a question and say, what if this bad thing were to happen? Or they try to prove an argument and they say, this policy would allow this bad thing to happen, but they don't prove why that bad thing is going to happen often at all, or enough to ever be a problem. So for instance, I'll give you a debating argument. There's a common motion, which I think you guys discussed in your lecture the other day, is this house would build social housing in high wealth areas. So build subsidized housing for people that otherwise can't afford it in areas that are otherwise very expensive. And a very common argument in that debate is to say that it fosters integration, that you're going to have people from different social backgrounds that otherwise live in different neighborhoods, becoming friends with each other and ending classism and racism and stereotypes in society. Now, this argument is a good one, but there is one very big question there, which I would ask if I was in opposition, which is, why would they ever talk to each other? Why would they ever do this? You need to prove that it's likely that they would have positive relationships just because they live in the same area. And that's not always going to be the case. It's quite easy in opposition, at least in that debate, to say that you are likely to be angry because they're moving into your neighborhood and ruining it. So therefore you won't want to talk to them. If you have those stereotypes from a very long period of your life, you're unlikely to let them go immediately. You're likely to see them with prejudice. You're likely to be scared of talking to them in some cases. So it's not obvious at all that if you want to fix racism or classism, you'd be able to convince those people to talk to them, right? Specifically the racist ones or specifically the classist ones. So what you need to do therefore in proposition is not just to say they might talk to each other, and that would be very good, but you need to explain why necessarily it's likely they would talk to each other, and that would be positive. So for example, they're likely to see each other at the supermarket, they're likely to go to the same school. Most people's racism isn't overt racism, but more like hidden subconscious biases. And that means they'd be unlikely to admit it to themselves, and they would still talk to these people a little bit. And that's enough to, over the long term, build relationships. Okay? So that's the question you need to answer. Not only why could a good thing happen, but why will a good thing happen? You want to find structural reasons inherent to the motion, why it's always going to be the case that something good will happen, or that it's going to happen often. Another example is if you're talking about banning gambling or banning alcohol. You want to say that there's going to be a lot of people that consume it irrationally. Either they gamble too much and lose their money, or maybe they drink too much and then they harm themselves. And a good thing with that argument is to give reasons for why that happens often, not only sometimes. So explaining how gambling works, why it's addictive, why it's advertised in a way that makes you think you're likely to win more than lose, why the human psychology means that you're likely to focus on the positives and think that you're the odd one out and you're going to win more than you lose. Those factors are very important in your explanation to convince people that you're not asserting that something is going to be caused by the motion, but you're explaining why it's likely to be caused by the motion. So why people are likely to act a certain way, okay? Rather than only it's possible that they would act a certain way. The next tip that I want to give you guys, and this is quite an important one, is nuance, both in the consequences that you try to prove and also in your characterizations. So in terms of consequences, very often people are trying to prove arguments and they try to go for the biggest possible consequence. Things like, this will lead to World War III, this will end the Israel-Palestine conflict, this will lead to the collapse of the European Union, this will end discrimination, this will end sexism. And those things are tempting because if you can prove that conclusion, then it's obvious that it's important and that everyone should agree with you. The problem is that it's difficult to prove that conclusion, and there's a chance you are left with nothing because you're slightly exaggerating what the consequences of the policy will be. So, as in life, it is better to underpromise and overdeliver. So it's better to understate your impacts, understate the conclusion you're talking about, but then make sure that you prove that 100%, that you give a lot of reasons for why maybe this policy wouldn't collapse the European Union, maybe it wouldn't lead to World War III, but it would increase tensions in a way that can still cost a lot of civilian lives. It would escalate the conflict, or it would increase anti-EU skepticism that makes it harder to push positive policies. Okay, so ask yourself, what is the likely realistic outcome? And try to be as nuanced and sensible as possible. Otherwise, it's very easy for the opposition to attack you and say that you're exaggerating, and therefore discredit your logic and leave you with nothing. But also, you need to be nuanced when you're describing people. Very often, people try to make arguments like this will help the poor, this will help women, this will help religious people, or otherwise arguments like religious people act in a certain way, or women want a certain kind of benefit. And those arguments are inherently uncompelling. The reason for that is that groups, those aren't natural groupings, right? Not all women think the same thing. Not all poor people are poor for the same reasons, and therefore they need different things. They have different priorities and different backgrounds. Conservatives, political conservatives, want to conserve a lot of different things. LGBT people exist on a range in the political spectrum and have very different needs and beliefs and priorities. Okay, so whenever you're talking about a group and explaining that something is going to happen or that you need to help a certain group, you need to A, explain what makes that group a group, explain what things they have in common, and B, don't feel like you need to defend the entirety of a group. Don't feel like you need to say this policy will help all women, this policy will help all religious people, this policy will help all minorities, but you can say this policy is going to help a subset of women that we think are important. For example, it's going to help socioeconomically disadvantaged women. It's going to help minority women. Here is what those people need. By virtue of being women and having a certain background, we can assume they have certain things in common, right? That perhaps not all women would have because they're a broader group. Or similarly, if you're talking about prisoners, or if you're talking about voters, if you're talking about any group of people in society, refugees, ISIS fighters, the left, anything like that, you need to justify what things do they have in common, and therefore what does that mean that they will act a certain way, and try not to exaggerate and claim that you're defending a very, very big group, because the truth is more nuanced than that, and it's always going to be possible for your opponents to say, that's not true, there's a lot of women that don't want that, or there's a lot of conservatives that don't want that, or a lot of refugees that have a different background. So be nuanced in your impacts and be nuanced in your characterizations, because that makes your argument much more plausible and therefore much easier to convince people of it. I'm going to give you guys just two more pieces of advice. So one of them is you need to preempt attacks and you need to overcome them. One of the best strategies whenever you are making an argument is to ask yourself, what is the other side going to say? What is the benefit that they're going to try to prove in this debate? Or what is it they care about? What are their concerns? What do they care about? And how can I get them to change their mind? But also, how are they going to attack your argument? What piece of the logic are they likely to attack? What part are they going to disagree with? Okay. If you were saying that you're going to get more social integration by building housing in a certain area, are they likely to either say that integration doesn't matter, or are they likely to say that integration isn't going to work? They're likely to contest the latter. They're likely to say that you're going to make integration worse rather than better. So that's the bit of your argument you need to strengthen. Okay, so two pieces of exercises that are very useful whenever you're preparing an essay, a presentation, or indeed a debate speech is ask yourself, firstly, ask a lot of why questions. Ask, why is this true? Why is this important? Has this happened before? Who does it affect? When is this likely to play out? Why? What kind of benefits follow from this? What happens in the short term? What happens in the long term? How are different groups of people going to react? Etc., etc. That allows you to add more detail and more analysis to your argument, and it helps you to explain it better in a way that is more credible. But also ask yourself, if I was in opposition, if I had to speak after this argument, how would I attack it? How would I rebut it? What bits would I attack and what bits would I think were just complete logical leaps? And then go back to your argument and fix your argument so that those attacks don't work anymore. Okay, that's called preempting attacks, and you need to do that and you need to overcome them. And that means essentially that your opposition is always one step behind. Before they attack your argument, you've already explained why their immediate attack to it doesn't work, right? Why the argument is more sophisticated than that. And then they need to go through much further lengths to show why that argument doesn't stand. Okay, and the very last piece of advice that I will give you is also think of how you're going to respond to the other side. A lot of debating is about listening, understanding and respecting the other side. That is taking them at their very best and showing why they are not going to get the benefits that they care about and the outcomes that they think they're going to get. So you need to listen very carefully to what they really want to prove and the outcomes they want to achieve, and then beat them on their own grounds, right? There's three or so different things you can do. I'm not going to get into the detail of it, but you can either mitigate their benefits, and you can say you're not going to achieve benefits that are as big as you say, right? Perhaps you're going to reduce discrimination, but you're not going to fix it. Or, well, we are also fixing discrimination on our side, so there's nothing you're doing that we can't also do. for example, you can also refute their logic, and you can say, no, that logic doesn't happen. If you want to help the group you want to help, actually you need to do it on our side. And there's a third thing you can do, which is you can explain why your benefits are more important than theirs, and their benefits are actually irrelevant. Okay, so to give you an example of how important it is to expect what they're going to say and then beat them on that from the start, let's take a motion about privacy, right? A common motion in debating is that the government should be allowed to spy on citizens without their consent, right? Without requiring a court order, anything of the sort, would just give the government powers to spy on their citizens. If you stop and ask yourselves for a minute, what is this debate about? Where is the trade-off going to happen? Where is the main disagreement going to be? It's likely going to be one of security versus privacy. Okay, I think that's pretty obvious. In proposition, you're likely to say that spying on your citizens is helpful to security, and it's preventing terrorism, preventing attacks. And on opposition, you are likely to talk about privacy, and you're likely to say that it's a freedom that people should have, that that they shouldn't feel watched all the time, and that it's illegitimate for the government to do this. So therefore, if you're in proposition, you need to ask yourself, what's opposition going to say? They're going to talk about privacy. And then you want to start winning on that comparison right from the start. You don't even need to wait for them to speak. And you can have 3 arguments. Argument 1, why spying on your citizens is helpful for security, why it helps you prevent very harmful attacks, for instance. Secondly, why it doesn't substantially harm privacy. Okay, you might say people consent to giving away their information all the time. It's information that private companies very often already have. It doesn't actually change your behavior. It's not harmful in and of itself to harm privacy, like we have CCTVs all the time, and we get used to it, so it's not a big deal, right? So you're attacking the privacy claim. And thirdly, why in the trade-off, if we need to give one of them up, privacy is less important than security. Okay, so why is the principle that the government should protect your security more important than the idea that it should protect your privacy at all costs? That is an excellent way to win that debate and convince people, because you're engaging on their own terms and saying why they're not going to get the harm to privacy they're concerned about, and you're also explaining why there's something else they need to think about, which is security, and explaining why you're going to get that security benefit. So when you're responding to arguments in real life as well, always try to take the other person at their best. And just like I've been giving you examples of mistakes that you don't want to commit whenever you're making an argument, it can also be useful to bear that in mind when you're attacking other arguments that people have made. Ask yourself if they've made some of these mistakes. So for example, are they assuming that an outcome will happen without really asking themselves how, asking themselves why? Are they assuming that something is necessarily good or bad without explaining if that's the case? Are they exaggerating their claims? Are they generalizing about a group of people and saying that, all people in a certain group have the same interests or will all act in the same way? Or are they ignoring the other side of the argument? Are they ignoring that there's very valuable principles that the other side might care about? There's other things as well, of course, like are there internal inconsistencies? Are they conflating 2 ideas? But I think these are a couple of the most important ones that happen at high levels of argument, whether it's political debates or trying to convince people at every level. So this was just designed to be an introduction to what are some things that you need to think about when you're building arguments. And there's loads more pieces of advice that I would give you. And if you guys are interested, there's an email address at the bottom of the YouTube clip, ca@scottisheudc2018.com, where you can send me an email and we can discuss debating in a little bit more detail. But the very last thing that I would say is I would recommend that you give it a go. That you give competitive debating a go if you have a chance at your university. Because firstly, it's a great way to keep on top of what happens all over the world. I can't claim that I'm an expert in every area, but I do know the main issues and concerns around almost every area. At least it feels that way compared to other people my age. From the Middle Eastern conflict to development, to the refugee crisis, to US gun control, to sexual harassment, to independence movements in Europe. You debate all of these things. And the more you do it, the more you get a sense of what the different concerns and the different groups are and where the disagreements lie. And it gives you a very useful understanding just when living in the world, really. And also, it gives you an incentive to read a lot because the only way that you can cheat at debating is by knowing a lot and already having a sense of what's important and what are the facts on the ground and winning with those facts. Secondly, it gives you a lot of very useful skills. Obviously, public speaking is a useful one, but I actually think even more than that, it gives you analytical thinking and the ability to respond on your feet, to point to gaps in arguments, and also how to know to approach a topic from scratch. in the format I debate in, which is British parliamentary, you have 15 minutes. They give you a topic, you have 15 minutes, and then you need to stand up and speak. And you don't have a chance to Google, you can't ask a friend, it's just you and your partner. So you get an amazing ability to approach a topic from scratch, having never thought about something before. Suddenly you need to answer, okay, what should the feminist movement prioritize in the fight for equality? Or, okay, what are the pros and cons of recognizing the independence of Kurdistan, right? So you learn how to develop your thoughts very quickly and how to approach topics with little information. And lastly, I would say that debating gives you an amazing community of people as well. There's hundreds of people every weekend gathering at tournaments all across Europe, from Helsinki or Lund or Riga to Portugal or Moscow or Athens or London or Dublin. And it's an amazing way to meet people from all over the world that are also incredibly engaged in politics and incredibly interested in the world, and often very charismatic as well. So I found it an amazing experience, and I recommend that you guys give it a go. But even if you're never thinking of debating, hopefully this has been useful in terms of asking yourself how to structure an argument and what are the important steps that you need to take to make sure that you're convincing your adversaries and attacking them in ways that are going to be very successful for your argument. So my name's Olivia. Thanks a lot for this workshop, and get in touch if you have any questions. Thanks a lot for listening.